A kind gesture. On a warm and peaceful afternoon, 10-year-old Lily sat on a worn-out park bench, absorbed in the drawing she had been working on for the past hour. Her sketchbook, fraying at the edges from constant use, lay open in her lap as she meticulously captured the delicate curve of a butterfly perched on a flower. The world around her buzzed with the sound of laughter and shouts from children running wild in the nearby playground. They were carefree, lost in their games, but Lily didn't mind. She was content in her solitude, her quiet little world of paper and pencil. A soft breeze ruffled her hair as she focused on her drawing, the tip of her pencil moving in smooth strokes over the page. Her thoughts were consumed by the task at hand, no distractions, no worries. But suddenly, a faint shiver ran down her spine. Her eyes flicked up from her sketchbook, and her gaze landed on something that disrupted her calm. Across the park, just past the swings and the climbing structure, there was a man sitting alone on a park bench. His appearance immediately struck Lily, as he looked out of place in the otherwise joyful scene. His clothes were old and tattered, faded from years of wear and tear, and they hung loosely on his frame. His shoes were scuffed and covered in dirt. His face was gaunt, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and his unkempt hair looked as if it hadn't been touched by a comb in weeks. He looked like he had seen too much of the world's harshness, far beyond the innocence of children playing in the park. Lily's heart tightened. She had seen him before, often wandering the park, sitting on various benches, looking lost in his own thoughts. She noticed that people rarely paid him any attention. They would avoid making eye contact, crossing the street or walking a little faster to get past him. He was invisible to most, just a fixture in the background of their lives, and Lily couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for him. She knew better than to stare for too long, so she turned her attention back to her sketch. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the man. He sat there, staring ahead, unmoving. Was he hungry? Was he lonely? She felt a deep sense of empathy for him, a kind of quiet understanding that urged her to do something, anything to help. But what could she do? She was just a little girl, after all. The warmth of the afternoon sun seemed to make everything feel more vivid. The laughter of the children echoed in her ears, and for a moment, she allowed herself to enjoy the moment, the freedom of youth, the joy of simple things. But the nagging thought of the man's hunger and loneliness remained at the back of her mind. What if he didn't have enough to eat? What if he was just waiting for someone to notice him, to acknowledge him as a person? Lily's mother always taught her the importance of kindness, to look out for others, especially those who were struggling. The smallest act of kindness can change someone's entire day, Lily, she often said. Never underestimate the power of a simple smile or a helping hand. Lily thought about that now, the words ringing in her ears as she looked at the man again. Without really thinking it through, she reached into her bag and pulled out the lunch her mother had made for her that morning. It was a simple peanut butter and jelly sandwich, nothing fancy, but enough to fill her up. She had been looking forward to it all day, but now, as she gazed at the man across the park, it felt trivial. In her heart, she knew there was something more important than her sandwich. There was the opportunity to make a difference, no matter how small. She stood up, hesitated for a moment, and then walked over to the man. As she approached, she noticed the way he sat, his shoulders hunched, his head slightly bowed. He didn't seem to notice her at first, lost in his own thoughts. But Lily wasn't deterred. She stopped a few feet away from him and cleared her throat, just loud enough to catch his attention. "Excuse me, sir," Lily said, her voice small but clear. "Would you like my sandwich?" I thought you might be hungry." The man slowly lifted his head, his tired eyes meeting hers. His face was weathered, with deep lines etched from years of hardship. He studied her for a moment, his eyes scanning her innocent face, as if trying to make sense of what she had just said. His lips parted, but no words came out immediately. Lily felt a flutter of uncertainty in her chest, but she held her ground. She couldn't back out now. It's just peanut butter and jelly, Lily added, trying to make it sound casual. I didn't want it to go to waste. The man stared at the sandwich in her outstretched hand, his gaze shifting from the food to her face and back again. A brief moment of hesitation passed, and then he slowly shook his head. No, little one, he said, his voice raspy. I couldn't possibly take your food. You need it more than I do. Lily was undeterred. She had seen people like him before, too proud to accept help, too used to fending for themselves. She wouldn't let that stop her. She tore the sandwich in half, then broke each half into smaller pieces. She held one of the pieces out to him with both hands, offering it like a gift. Please, she said softly. I really want you to have it. For a long moment, the man said nothing. His eyes softened, and his face seemed to lose some of its hardened edge. He looked down at the sandwich in her hands, and then back up at her, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than before. Finally, he sighed deeply, as if making a decision. Slowly, he reached out with trembling hands and took the sandwich from her, his fingers brushing hers. Thank you, he murmured, his voice barely audible. Lily smiled, her heart swelling with quiet pride. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of fulfillment that was far more satisfying than the sandwich itself. She stepped back, watching him take a small bite. It was only a simple thing, a sandwich, a moment of kindness, but to Lily, it felt like she had done something meaningful. She returned to her bench and sat down, glancing over at the man as she resumed her drawing. He seemed to have settled into a more relaxed position, taking small, careful bites of the sandwich. Lily felt content in her decision, her mind returning to the quiet rhythm of her pencil on paper. But as she sketched, she noticed something strange. The man's face had grown paler, and his body seemed to tremble. He dropped the sandwich on the ground and began coughing violently. Lily's eyes widened in alarm. She stood up quickly, her heart racing. Sir, she called, her voice shaking. Are you okay? But the man didn't respond. His breathing became labored, his body jerking as if he was fighting something. Panic surged through Lily, and before she knew it, she was running toward him, her feet pounding the ground. Somebody help, she screamed, her voice cracking with fear. Please, help him. The park seemed to freeze for a moment, the noise of children and chatter fading away as Lily dropped to her knees beside the man. She tried to shake him gently, calling out again, but he was unresponsive. His body jerked with a sudden convulsion, and his eyes rolled back in his head. Lily's stomach twisted in terror. Help, she screamed again, louder this time. Please, help him. The unexpected consequence. Panic surged through Lily as she knelt beside the man, her hands trembling as she tried to get him to respond. His body was convulsing uncontrollably, and his breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. She didn't know what to do. She had never seen someone react like this before. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her thoughts scrambled. Was he choking? Was he having a heart attack? Had she done something wrong by offering him the sandwich? Tears blurred her vision as she looked around desperately, hoping for someone to step in and help. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw the faces of bystanders, their expressions unreadable as they watched the scene unfold. Some stared in confusion, others looked on with suspicion, but no one moved toward her or the man. Help! Somebody, please, she cried again, her voice breaking as the fear bubbled up from deep within her. A woman near the playground glanced over but quickly turned away, her face tight with discomfort. A group of teenagers in the distance paused for a moment, their laughter dying down as they noticed what was happening, but they too remained frozen in place. Lily could feel the weight of their eyes on her, and her heart sank. Why wasn't anyone helping? Why were they just standing there, watching? Finally, a man in the crowd rushed forward, his face set in a grim expression. He was wearing a suit, his phone already in his hand. "I'm calling an ambulance," he said quickly, his voice clipped. As he dialed, Lily felt a faint flicker of hope. The paramedics would come, and they would know what to do. But even as the man spoke to the dispatcher on the phone, Lily could see the fear in the eyes of the people around them. They weren't just concerned about the man, no, they were eyeing her. Their glances were sharp, laden with suspicion. Some were whispering to one another, their voices low but urgent. Lily's breath caught in her throat, and she felt a strange chill wash over her. The kindness she had shown only moments before seemed to be transforming into something dark and dangerous. Something she couldn't understand. The man on the bench continued to struggle. His coughing fit worsened, and his body jerked once more. His eyes were wide open now, but they seemed to be staring at nothing. The desperation in his movement sent a wave of nausea over Lily. She felt so small, so powerless. She had wanted to help, but now it seemed as though everything was spiraling out of control. Within moments, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder as an ambulance pulled up to the park entrance. 2 paramedics rushed out of the vehicle and hurried toward the scene. They were quick and efficient, moving the bystanders aside without a second thought. One of the paramedics knelt beside the man, checking his pulse and examining his breathing. Lily stood back, her hands still shaking as she watched. She wanted to explain what had happened, to tell them that she had just offered him a sandwich, a simple act of kindness. But her words stuck in her throat. No one was listening. No one was asking questions. Instead, the paramedics worked swiftly, stabilizing the man and preparing him for transport. The crowd began to dissipate, but Lily could still feel their eyes on her, still hear the whispers that hung in the air like a thick fog. Some people seemed to exchange uneasy glances, as though they had witnessed something wrong, something that shouldn't have happened. As the paramedics wheeled the man away in the ambulance, Lily's stomach twisted with confusion and dread. She had only wanted to help. Wasn't that a good thing? Why did it feel like she was the one being judged? The park, which had once felt like a safe and familiar place, now felt alien and threatening. The police arrived just minutes later, their sirens wailing as they pulled up next to the ambulance. 2 officers, one male and one female, stepped out of the squad car and began making their way toward the scene. The male officer immediately looked at Lily, his gaze sharp and intense. "Step aside, little girl," he said, his voice stern, as he gestured for her to move away from the area. His tone was harsh, and it made Lily flinch. She backed away, her heart racing, unsure of what was happening. The female officer, more composed, walked over to the paramedics and began asking questions about the man's condition. Lily felt a knot of dread tighten in her chest. What was going on? Why were the police here? She had only tried to be kind. The male officer turned back to her, his face unreadable. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice colder than before. Lily swallowed hard, her mouth dry. I gave him my sandwich," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I thought he might be hungry. I didn't mean for anything to happen. I just wanted to help." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "You gave him your sandwich," he repeated, as if trying to make sense of her words. His eyes scanned her face, and Lily could feel the weight of his gaze as if he were searching for something. "Did you know this man? Do you know anything about him?" Lily shook her head quickly. "No, I don't know him. I just saw him sitting there, and he looked like he might be hungry, so I gave him my sandwich." The officer's expression hardened, and he exchanged a brief glance with his partner. The air between them seemed to crackle with tension. "Was there anything else in that sandwich?" the officer asked, his tone more insistent now. Lily stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked. "It was just peanut butter and jelly. There's nothing in it that could hurt him." The officer's eyes narrowed. "You didn't put anything else in it?" No pills, no chemicals, nothing unusual? Lily's head spun, and her heart skipped a beat. No. I didn't, she was about to explain again, but the officer interrupted her, his voice cold and authoritative. All right, stay right here, he said sharply. We'll be speaking with you further. Lily opened her mouth to protest, to explain that she hadn't done anything wrong, but the words were caught in her throat. The officer didn't wait for her to respond. He turned and walked away, his boots echoing in the silence that had settled over the park. Lily felt the weight of the world on her shoulders as she stood there, alone. The afternoon sun, once warm and comforting, now felt harsh and unforgiving. She couldn't understand why things had gone so wrong, so quickly. All she had done was offer a sandwich to someone in need, yet now it seemed as if she had done something terrible. The police officers spoke briefly with the remaining witnesses, but Lily barely heard their words. She couldn't shake the image of the man's pale face, his shaking hands, and the terror in his eyes as he struggled for breath. What had happened to him? Was he all right? Was he going to be okay? Minutes felt like hours as she stood there, rooted to the spot, her mind racing with questions and fear. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but one thing was certain, her life had just changed forever. The officers soon left, the woman giving Lily one last look before walking away. But the heaviness in Lily's heart remained. The man was in the hospital now, but she had no idea what would happen to her. The situation had escalated so quickly, and the feeling of being blamed for something she hadn't intended to do hung over her like a dark cloud. Lily took a deep breath, wiping the tears that had begun to trickle down her face. She couldn't shake the feeling that things were just getting started. And no matter how hard she tried to explain her innocence, the world outside seemed to be turning against her. The storm of public opinion. The days that followed felt like a blur to Lily and her family. What had begun as a simple, innocent gesture of kindness had quickly spiraled into something far beyond their control. The media, like a hungry predator, pounced on the story, twisting the events into something far darker. By the time Lily's parents were finally able to speak to the reporters, the headlines had already been printed. Young girl's act of kindness turns deadly, poison sandwich incident, one newspaper screamed. Another had a more ominous tone, little girl's inexplicable actions lead to public chaos. These sensationalized reports painted Lily not as a compassionate child, but as a criminal, a suspect whose good intentions had inadvertently caused tragedy. The first time Lily saw the headlines, she didn't understand. She hadn't poisoned anyone. She hadn't hurt anyone. She had simply offered a sandwich to a man who seemed hungry. But the media didn't care about her intentions. They cared about a story, a narrative that would get people talking. And talk they did. The story spread like wildfire, reaching social media, news broadcasts, and even talk shows. It seemed that everyone had an opinion on what had happened, and most of those opinions were steeped in judgment. Comment threads exploded with anger and confusion. Some people believed Lily was a victim of circumstances, a well-meaning child whose good deed had gone horribly wrong. But others were not so understanding. The girl should have known better, one comment read. She's old enough to understand what she was doing. Her actions have consequences. They're just covering for her. She probably meant to hurt him. No one can be that innocent, another commenter wrote. Even more chilling were the calls for punishment. She should be held accountable, some argued. Her negligence cost someone their life. This is manslaughter, pure and simple. As the public fury mounted, Lily's parents found themselves at the center of the storm. They had been trying to shield their daughter from the media, but it was impossible to escape the constant barrage of reporters knocking at their door, microphones thrust in their faces. People came to their home at all hours of the day, demanding statements, demanding an explanation. It wasn't long before the family became reclusive, retreating from the world as they tried to process the chaos around them. The once quiet, peaceful neighborhood that Lily had known for her entire life became a place of whispers and side-eye glances. Neighbors who had once been friendly were now distant, avoiding eye contact with the family. The weight of public opinion was suffocating. Lily's mother, Sandra, often cried herself to sleep, and her father, Marcus, became irritable, snapping at anyone who dared to ask about the incident. No one seemed to care that they were grieving too. Grieving for the man in the hospital, grieving for their daughter's lost innocence, grieving for the life they once had before the world's cruel gaze had turned upon them. Lily, who had never experienced anything like this before, was devastated. At first, she tried to ignore the whispers and the stares, but they followed her everywhere. When she went to school, her classmates would avoid her, not wanting to get too close. Some would look at her with pity, while others would sneer. "That's the girl who poisoned the man," they would say, or worse, they would mutter it under their breath when they thought she couldn't hear. Her teachers were sympathetic, but even they couldn't shield her from the harshness of the outside world. One afternoon, as Lily sat in the back of her classroom, her hands clenched tightly around her pencil, she overheard two girls whispering about her. One of them, a girl named Jessica who had once been her friend, said, "I heard she was a part of some shady group, you know. They say she's been in trouble before. Maybe she's always been like this, just waiting for the right moment to hurt someone." The words stung like daggers, and Lily's face burned with humiliation. Her mind spun with confusion. She had never done anything wrong in her life. She had never hurt anyone. She was just a little girl who had tried to do something kind. But now, because of one incident, her entire life was being painted with a brush of suspicion. That night, as Lily sat in her room, staring out the window at the darkened streets below, she felt a deep sense of isolation. Her family was in turmoil, and she was trapped in a world that didn't understand her. She thought of the man, the one she had tried to help. What had happened to him? Why hadn't anyone believed her when she said it was an accident? Why had everything become so twisted? Meanwhile, the media had dug into the man's past. They revealed his true identity, Leonardo Goldman, a wealthy businessman and jeweler with a long history of success. But more importantly, they uncovered a detail that became a crucial piece of the puzzle: Leonardo had a severe egg allergy. The sandwich Lily had given him, made with peanut butter, had contained a trace of egg from the bread. It was a minor ingredient, easily overlooked, but it was enough to trigger an allergic reaction in someone with such a severe allergy. The man had gone into anaphylactic shock, and that was what had caused the collapse, not anything malicious in the sandwich itself. However, the story that emerged was not one of innocent mistake. The media twisted it further, insinuating that Lily had known about the allergy all along, that she had intentionally put the man in harm's way. It didn't matter that she was just a child, that her mother had made the sandwich without thinking of any potential allergens. The public's need for a villain was too strong. In the midst of all this chaos, Lily's parents received an official notice from the local authorities. A court date had been set. Lily would have to face the consequences of her actions. The charge? Involuntary manslaughter. The mere thought of it sent a chill through their hearts. Lily's family hired a lawyer, a kind and patient man named Mr. Thompson, who assured them that he would do everything in his power to ensure that Lily wasn't punished too harshly. But despite his efforts, the court date loomed over them like a dark cloud. And as the day drew closer, the pressure from the outside world only intensified. The night before the court hearing, Lily sat in her room, trying to prepare herself for what was coming. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and guilt. She hadn't meant for any of this to happen. She hadn't meant to hurt anyone. But no matter how many times she told herself that, the weight of the world seemed to press down on her. Her mother came into her room, sitting beside her on the bed. Sandra placed a hand on Lily's shoulder, offering comfort without words. Lily looked up at her, her eyes filled with tears. "Mom, I didn't do anything wrong. I just wanted to help him." Why is everyone saying I'm bad? Sandra pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her tightly. I know, sweetie. I know. You did what you thought was right. But sometimes the world doesn't see things the way we do. All we can do is be honest and stay true to ourselves. Lily clung to her mother, her small body shaking with sobs. She didn't know how much more of this she could take. But her mother's comforting presence, even in the midst of the storm, gave her a sense of strength that she didn't know she had. Tomorrow, everything would change. But for now, all Lily could do was hold on to the love and support of her family and hope that somehow, the truth would come to light. The courtroom and the weight of guilt. The day of the court hearing arrived, and the weight of it pressed down on Lily's shoulders like a suffocating blanket. The sky was overcast, and a light drizzle fell from the heavens, adding to the sense of unease that seemed to hang over everything. Lily could barely breathe, the air heavy with anxiety and the knowledge that her life was about to be irrevocably altered. She had never imagined a day like this. A few days ago, she was just a 10-year-old girl with big dreams, drawing in the park, unaware that an innocent act of kindness could lead to this moment. Now, she was facing charges for something that had been a tragic accident, a terrible misunderstanding, but one that could define the rest of her life. Lily, her parents, and their lawyer, Mr. Thompson, stood in the hallway outside the courtroom. Her mother, Sandra, held Lily's hand tightly, her own fingers trembling with nerves. Lily's father, Marcus, stood beside them, his posture stiff, his eyes distant. The strain was evident on his face. Despite his normally composed demeanor, the weight of the situation had begun to wear him down. He hadn't spoken much in the past few days, and his silence felt like a growing chasm between him and Lily. The strain of public pressure, the judgment, the constant media intrusion, it was all beginning to erode the walls they had built as a family. Lily stood between her parents, her gaze fixed on the floor, unable to meet the eyes of anyone around her. The courtroom was just down the hall, a place where her fate would be decided, but it felt like another world, one she wasn't ready to face. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she felt the heat of guilt rising within her. Despite her innocence, despite the fact that she had simply wanted to help, the enormity of the charge weighed on her. Involuntary manslaughter. The term echoed in her mind, haunting her. She couldn't fathom how her life had come to this, how a simple act of kindness had spiraled into something so devastating. Remember, Mr. Thompson said gently, crouching down to her level. You don't have to say anything you're not comfortable with. This isn't your fault. It was a tragic accident. The most important thing is that you stay calm and speak the truth when it's your turn. Lily nodded, trying to absorb his words, but the doubt gnawing at her gut made it hard to hold on to them. What if they didn't believe her? What if they thought she had done it on purpose? What if she was going to be punished for trying to do something good? Are you ready? Sandra asked softly, her voice trembling. Lily hesitated for a moment, then nodded again. She wasn't ready, she didn't think anyone could be ready for something like this, but she had no choice. Her family was depending on her, and so was the truth. As they entered the courtroom, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to swallow them whole. The walls, stark and cold, seemed to close in around them, reflecting the tension and dread that filled the room. The judge, an elderly man with a stern face, sat at the front of the room, flanked by the court clerks. On the opposite side, the prosecution team sat, their expressions unreadable as they prepared to present their case. Lily could feel their eyes on her as she walked in, each one judging, each one already certain of her guilt. The gallery was packed with people, some from the media, some from the community, all there to witness the trial of the little girl who had allegedly caused someone's death. The whispers from the audience hit Lily like a wave, the voices full of suspicion and judgment. She wanted to shrink into herself, to disappear. But she held her head high, doing her best to look composed as she took her seat beside her parents. The weight of the world seemed to bear down on her, and yet, she clung to the hope that her truth would shine through the darkness. The man she had tried to help, Leonardo, was in a hospital bed, his condition stable, but his recovery uncertain. His life had been turned upside down just as hers had. The trial began, and the prosecution wasted no time in painting Lily as a dangerous figure. The assistant district attorney, a sharp and calculating woman named Angela Carter, stood and addressed the court. She spoke with a tone that was both condescending and accusatory, weaving a narrative that painted Lily's actions as deliberate. Lily Turner, a young girl of just 10 years, saw an opportunity to make her mark in the world, Angela Carter began, her eyes fixed on Lily as though she were already guilty. An opportunity to be noticed. She saw a man she knew nothing about, and decided that, rather than simply giving him help, she would offer him something laced with harmful intent. A sandwich, the very same sandwich that would send him into a life-threatening allergic reaction. Lily's stomach twisted as she listened. She had never meant for this to happen. She had never imagined that something so simple, so innocent, could have such dire consequences. Yet here it was, her life on trial. The prosecutor continued. This was no ordinary act of kindness, Your Honor. No, this was an act of negligence. Of irresponsibility. And the consequences were severe. The man, Leonardo Goldman, a successful businessman with a known allergy to eggs, found himself fighting for his life because of Lily Turner's reckless decision. Lily's heart sank as the prosecutor painted her as a villain. The words stung, each one a reminder of the fear and guilt that had become her constant companions since the incident. She looked up at her parents, their faces pale, their eyes filled with pain. How could anyone understand what she had truly done? How could they know that she had simply been trying to help? Angela Carter turned to face the judge. Lily Turner's actions led directly to Mr. Goldman's collapse. There is no question about the severity of the consequences. She may have been young, but the responsibility of her actions cannot be ignored. The prosecution's case was clear. Lily had been careless, had acted without thinking, and her mistake had caused irreparable harm. They painted her as a child who had made a fatal error, an error that could not be undone. When it was Lily's turn to speak, her lawyer, Mr. Thompson, rose to his feet. Your Honor, what the prosecution fails to consider is the fact that Lily Turner did not act out of malice, but out of a desire to help. She saw a man in need, and her innocent, childlike desire to do something good led her to make an offer of food. She had no knowledge of Mr. Goldman's allergy. She did not intend to cause harm, and she certainly did not act with the intent to poison anyone. It was a tragic accident, a mistake, yes, but not one that was born out of negligence or malice. Lily felt a flicker of hope as Mr. Thompson spoke on her behalf. He had been kind to her, patient, and understanding. He believed in her innocence, and his words offered a sliver of comfort amidst the storm of accusations. Yet, despite his defense, Lily could still feel the weight of the court's gaze upon her. The air was thick with the unspoken judgment of everyone in the room. She looked up at the judge, his face impassive, and for a moment, she wondered if he could see the truth in her eyes. Could he see the girl who had simply tried to be kind? Could he see her desperation, her desire to make things right? Or was she just another headline, another story to be consumed by the public's insatiable thirst for scandal? As the day wore on, the courtroom grew colder. The prosecution's case was relentless, and the defense was trying its best to hold ground. But every word, every argument seemed to be another step closer to something Lily couldn't fathom, something she feared. A conviction. A punishment. A life forever changed. And then, it was her turn to speak. Her voice shook as she rose from her seat, her hands clammy with nerves. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. I didn't mean to hurt him, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know. I didn't know he had an allergy. I just wanted to help. I thought he was hungry. "I never meant for this to happen." Her words hung in the air, fragile and vulnerable. The truth, simple and pure, but impossible to ignore. The room held its breath. The unraveling truth. The days that followed in the courtroom were long, stretching on like an endless series of hurdles for Lily and her family. Each session revealed more of the ugly reality that had taken shape around their lives. The trial had become a spectacle, a form of entertainment for those hungry for scandal, and despite their best efforts, Lily's family found themselves trapped in the relentless pressure of public scrutiny. But it wasn't just the world outside the courtroom that weighed heavily on their shoulders, it was the room itself, the cold, unyielding atmosphere of the judicial system that seemed intent on turning Lily's life upside down. The defense continued to argue that Lily's actions had been unintentional, driven by nothing but the innocent kindness of a child who simply wanted to feed someone who appeared hungry. But with every witness that the prosecution called, the pressure mounted. The witnesses were professionals, medical experts who spoke of the severity of allergic reactions, neighbors who claimed that Lily had been acting strangely in the days before the incident, and even a couple of anonymous tipsters who alleged that Lily had been seen near Leonardo's mansion before the day in question. Each new piece of testimony seemed to paint Lily in a more suspicious light. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder, and Lily began to feel as though the walls were closing in around her once more. She couldn't understand what was happening. Why were people who didn't know her judging her so harshly? Why was this turning into something so dark when all she had done was try to help? As the defense presented its own arguments, Mr. Thompson's calm and rational voice stood as a stark contrast to the aggressive nature of the prosecution. He called in a series of character witnesses, Lily's teachers, neighbors, and a few friends from her school. They all spoke highly of Lily, describing her as kind, generous, and empathetic. But despite the kind words, it felt like there was something missing, a lack of understanding about the larger issue at hand. "The girl is only 10, her teacher, Mrs. Green, said on the stand, her voice firm with conviction. "She is not capable of understanding the consequences of such a complex situation. She is not an adult, and she did not know about Mr. Goldman's allergy. This was an accident. A tragic one, yes, but an accident nonetheless." Despite this, the prosecution pressed on, determined to make their case. They brought in an expert who spoke about how children, even young ones, could be responsible for their actions, especially when the consequences were so severe. They insisted that Lily should have known better. That a child her age should have recognized the danger in offering food to a stranger. Even the media, who had once treated the case as a curiosity, now seemed more insistent on casting Lily as a villain. The case had become more than just a legal matter. It was a reflection of the growing polarization in society. On one side, there were those who saw Lily as a scapegoat, a child who had made an innocent mistake, an act that had spiraled into something much worse through no fault of her own. On the other, there were those who demanded punishment, who saw her actions as recklessly irresponsible, even criminal. The people who were supposed to be there to support Lily, her friends, her family, now found themselves at the mercy of a much larger conversation. Through it all, Lily remained silent. She had been asked to speak again, but she wasn't sure what more she could say. She hadn't meant to hurt anyone. She had tried to explain it over and over, but each time, her words had been twisted, manipulated, and misunderstood. The turning point in the case came when a surprising witness was called, Leonardo Goldman himself. He had been in the hospital for several days after the incident, recovering from the anaphylactic shock caused by the egg in the sandwich. His recovery had been slow, but the doctors had assured him that he would survive. He had been hesitant to speak in public, but when his lawyer suggested he testify, he agreed, hoping to clear up the confusion that had surrounded his relationship with the young girl. Leonardo's testimony was a strange mix of emotion and confusion. He spoke in a calm, measured voice, acknowledging the unfortunate circumstances that had led to his collapse. He didn't blame Lily for what had happened, but he did express regret about not being more transparent about his allergy. I should have said something sooner, he admitted, looking at Lily from the witness stand. I should have told her about my allergy. But I didn't. And I never imagined that a simple sandwich could cause such a reaction. Lily sat frozen in her seat, listening to his words. This was the man she had tried to help. He wasn't angry with her, he wasn't looking for revenge, he seemed genuinely conflicted, caught in a situation that no one could have predicted. It was an accident, Leonardo continued, his voice breaking slightly. I know that. Lily didn't mean for this to happen. She's just a child. She wanted to help. I don't want her to be punished for something that was no one's fault. For the first time since the trial began, Lily felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this was the moment that could turn everything around. Perhaps, at last, the truth was coming through. But even as she tried to grasp that glimmer of hope, doubt still lingered in her mind. Was it enough? Would the jury believe Leonardo? Would they believe her? The prosecution, of course, wasn't satisfied with this testimony. They immediately tried to undermine Leonardo's character, questioning his credibility and his motives. Isn't it convenient, Mr. Goldman, that you suddenly decide to take the blame now, after weeks of media frenzy? Perhaps your admission of guilt is just a way to avoid taking responsibility for your own negligence. But the defense held strong, and by the end of the day, the judge had called for a brief recess. Lily and her parents sat in stunned silence as they waited for the courtroom to reconvene. The public's attention was momentarily diverted, but there was no escaping the weight of the trial. The constant scrutiny, the harsh judgment, it all hung around them, pressing down with a relentless force. Back at their home, the atmosphere was equally tense. The television was off, but the tension in the air felt just as thick. They were alone in the quiet house, a stark contrast to the noisy, chaotic scene at the courthouse. Lily sat on the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring at the floor. Her mother, Sandra, came over to sit beside her, running a hand through Lily's hair in an effort to comfort her. Are you okay, sweetie? Sandra asked softly. Lily looked up at her mother, her eyes red from crying earlier. I don't know, Mom. I just want it to be over. I don't want anyone to think I hurt him. Sandra's heart broke as she hugged her daughter tightly. You didn't. You were just trying to help. And I know you didn't mean for anything bad to happen. Lily nodded, wiping her eyes, though the sadness never seemed to lift. There was still so much unknown about how this was all going to play out. Could Leonardo's testimony be enough to clear her name? Would the jury see it the way her family did? All she could do was wait. Tomorrow would bring a new day. And with it, perhaps, a decision that could change everything. But for now, Lily allowed herself a small moment of peace, held by the warmth of her mother's embrace and the fragile hope that one day, the truth would finally come to light. The verdict and the aftermath. The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was even more charged than before. The media presence had escalated to an almost suffocating degree, with photographers lined up outside the building and cameras set up inside, all capturing every moment of this high-profile case. It felt like a circus, a tragic, unsettling spectacle that had become the focus of everyone in the city. Lily, her parents, and their lawyer sat together in a quiet corner of the courtroom, the air thick with anticipation. The judge had announced that after all the arguments had been presented, the jury would deliberate, and the decision would be made. In this tense limbo, no one knew what the outcome would be, but everyone understood that whatever happened next would alter their lives forever. The morning began with the closing statements. Both sides had presented their arguments, the prosecution relentlessly pressing the point that Lily's actions, despite her age, were the result of reckless disregard for the potential dangers of interacting with a stranger. They had insisted that her failure to ask Mr. Goldman about his medical condition or his allergies showed a lack of responsibility. They painted her as a naive child who had made a grave error, an error that, unfortunately, had led to irreversible consequences. Despite the genuine testimony from Leonardo, the prosecution was unwavering, focusing only on the end result rather than the intent. The defense, on the other hand, had fiercely argued that Lily's actions were based on pure, innocent intent, a child trying to do a good deed. They pointed to the character witnesses who described Lily's kindness, her empathy, and her youthful innocence. They reminded the court that a 10-year-old could not have been expected to have the awareness or the knowledge to anticipate the risks involved in giving food to someone she saw as hungry. They stressed that this was a tragic accident, not a deliberate act of harm, and that no one, including Lily, could have foreseen the catastrophic consequences that followed. As the defense finished its statement, Lily could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She had heard the arguments countless times now, but they had never felt as sharp as they did today. All the uncertainty, the confusion, the feeling of being misunderstood, it was all coming to a head. The judge gave a nod, signaling that the jury would now deliberate. For the first time in what felt like forever, the courtroom fell silent, the tension palpable as everyone awaited the inevitable decision. Outside the courtroom, the day had turned dark, the sky blanketed in gray clouds. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. The Turner family waited in a small holding room, the sound of the rain tapping against the windows serving as a constant reminder of how everything had spiraled out of control. Lily had spent much of the day in a daze. She couldn't stop thinking about the words the witnesses had said, the faces of the people who had come to testify against her, and the faces of the people who had spoken up in her defense. Leonardo's testimony had been a strange and unexpected turning point. He had taken full responsibility for his own role in the tragedy, acknowledging his failure to disclose his allergy. But the prosecution had managed to twist his words, implying that his late admission only raised more questions. Could he have been lying? Could it have all been a tactic to reduce his own culpability? Would the jury see it that way? Her parents remained by her side, their presence a constant comfort, though their own worry was impossible to hide. They knew that this was far more than just a legal battle, it was a battle for their family's dignity and future. The media, which had initially portrayed them as the innocent victims in this situation, had begun to turn. Some outlets questioned their parenting, wondering how they could have allowed such an innocent child to make such a mistake. Others suggested that Lily had been manipulated or influenced by a dangerous sense of entitlement, as if she thought she could do whatever she pleased without consequences. Lily felt it all, the judgment, the uncertainty, the shame. No matter what happened in the courtroom, she knew that her life had already been irrevocably changed. The headlines would follow her, the whispers would continue, and the world would never again see her the same way. She had tried to help, but it seemed like that act of kindness had been warped into something unrecognizable, something tragic. The waiting room was cold, the silence oppressive. A heavy hour passed, and just as Lily felt as though she could no longer endure the tension, the door to the holding room opened. A court officer stepped inside and gestured for them to follow. "The jury has reached a verdict," the officer said, his voice as neutral as ever. "It's time for the final decision." Lily's breath caught in her throat as she stood up slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. She looked at her parents, both of them standing tall beside her, though their faces were lined with worry. They walked with her into the courtroom, where the judge was already seated and the jury members sat at the front, their faces inscrutable. Lily's heart was a frantic drumbeat in her chest as they took their seats once more, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The judge cleared his throat, signaling the start of the reading. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood, holding a sheet of paper. "We have, Your Honor." The tension in the room was unbearable. The foreperson's voice echoed as they read the verdict aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Lily Turner, not guilty of involuntary manslaughter." Lily's breath escaped in a shuddering gasp. The words felt surreal, as though the world around her had suddenly tilted on its axis. Not guilty. She had expected something different, something worse, but the reality of hearing those 2 words, the weight of them, was beyond what she could have imagined. For a moment, she couldn't comprehend what was happening. It felt like a dream, a fleeting moment where everything she feared had dissolved into the air. Her mother burst into tears, her body shaking with relief, while her father stood motionless beside her, his expression one of quiet astonishment. Mr. Thompson, their lawyer, stood and nodded, his face showing a rare look of pride. The courtroom was filled with an eruption of murmurs and whispers, but all Lily could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat, slow and steady now, as if the storm inside her had finally passed. The judge spoke again. "The defendant is free to go, but I do urge this court to remember the tragic nature of this case. Let this serve as a reminder of the unforeseen consequences of even the most innocent actions." Lily couldn't focus on his words. All she could think about was the overwhelming relief flooding her body. She was free. But the victory felt hollow. She had been acquitted, yes, but the damage had already been done. Her name, her innocence, the moment of kindness she had extended, none of it could ever be the same again. She would always carry the weight of the incident with her, the knowledge that her actions had caused harm, even if unintentionally. Outside the courthouse, the rain had stopped. The clouds began to break, and a faint light peeked through, as though the world itself was offering a small, fragile hope. Lily stepped outside into the fresh air, surrounded by her family, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the weight lift from her shoulders. But she knew that this would not be the end. The media would move on to the next story, but she would carry this with her for the rest of her life. And though her name would be cleared in the eyes of the law, Lily knew that healing would take time. Not just for her, but for the people who had witnessed her struggle. For her family. And for Leonardo, who, despite everything, had extended the most unexpected of gestures, understanding. The road ahead would be long, but Lily had learned something she could never forget. Kindness, even when pure and true, can sometimes lead to places we never expect.